Well, for those of you out there, I want to again thank you for sharing some time with me today. I have to introduce this topic because someone else deserves the credit. I struggled for several years to come up with topics that intrigued or kept the attention of high school kids. And other than war, I had a miserable time. I did not succeed. And I was at Chaudere several years ago and talking to a table of young students and asked them, well, what do you want to hear about? And again, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, blah, 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 blah. And one quiet voice from the other side of the table said, was there anybody from Montana on the Titanic? And I don't know if you're familiar with Cleo, the muse of history, but Cleo hit me over the head. And I immediately came back, dropped everything else I was doing, and started researching. And I found that a shocking number of original Titanic papers are digitized and online. So a person can search those and look for the destination. And that's what I did initially, was look for destinations for the passengers. And it's been bittersweet because it's a harsh occurrence. And there's no way that I feel people can get involved in this without having your heartstrings tweaked a little. So with that said, thank you to teenagers who do not think in my box. And I really do appreciate it. All right, so this is a picture of who and what was waiting for them when the survivors of the Titanic came off of the rescue ship, the Carpathian. And it seems overwhelming to me, and I can't help but wonder about those, and there were many, many of them, who could not speak English being thrust into this crowd. But on the other hand, I do know that there were benevolent organizations. The Swedes had one, the Irish had them, and so on and so forth, that sponsored many of those, if not all, of the third-class passengers who, of course, arrived in New York with just the clothes on their back. So one in particular, Berta Nielsen, was given $50 and a ticket to Missoula. And that was a lot of money in those times. So I like to think that at least those worldly concerns were alleviated. So quick overview, as you know, April 14th, it was a Sunday night, the Titanic, which was designed to not sink, hit an iceberg. And before the sun came up, the Titanic was gone. And 2/3 of the people who had been on her were gone. There was as many as over 1,500 people who died that night. And only about a little over 700 were saved. Now, when I was first asked about the Titanic, I have to tell you that the only thing I thought of at the time was a gentleman by the name of L. Giddings, and he's in the lower right-hand corner. He's the one with the baseball hat on, and then on the left, the photo. This is one of the opening photos to the movie Titanic, and Mr. Giddings is in one of the submersibles. He was involved in I think it's a 1991 coordination with Russia and Canada and the United States and several other countries. And he was one of the cinematographers. Jim Cameron, the producer of Titanic, saw the footage and started writing the screenplay, is how the story goes. And when Jim Cameron then wanted to take his own photos, shall we say, for lack of a different term, he got Mr. Giddings to go with him. It's an amazing story. And if you've seen National Geographic or spent any time on, Facebook or Google, you know that it is a tragic scene. There's a beautiful ship on the bottom of the ocean, and there were a lot of souls that went down with her. So with that said, kudos to Mr. Giddings. I presented just a couple days ago to a small group, and one asked me about lifeboats. And I have to say, I had kept track of the lifeboats that the people headed for Montana were in, but I didn't have the whole picture. So I found out that in 1912, there was an overview, for lack of a different term, or some basic rules that ships had to carry enough lifeboats to provide for 1,060 passengers. And evidently the crew the crew were on their own, but that was the criteria. So originally, the decks of the Titanic were designed to have 32 lifeboats. Then the designers and the powers that be got to looking, and this is a quote, if they put 32 lifeboats up there, the deck will be too crowded and too cluttered. And so they went from 32 lifeboats to 20. And of those, I believe 3 were collapsible. And you can see the collapsible there on the bottom photo. The one with 2 X's on it is the collapsible. And it looks frail to me. The idea of spending the night in the Northern Atlantic on that boat just scares the heck out of me. But I want you to remember, and we're gonna talk about her. There's an 18-year-old Swedish girl on that boat by the name of Berta Nilsson, and she's headed for Missoula, Montana. Right, the numbers, and I've already mentioned just quickly the numbers, the totals. One of the things that struck me when I got to the down and dirty was just how much of an immigrant ship this was. So there were over 700 third class or steerage passengers, not quite 300 second class, and a little over 300 first class. But you had 2 out of 3 chances of surviving if you were in the first class, not even 50% surviving if you were in the second, and 1 out of 4 chances of surviving if you were in the third class. The crew, again, 24% of them survived. And many of those were picked up by the rowboats that would go back into the fray, for lack of a different term. And because when a lifeboat was launched, there were often 2 or 3 or more crew assigned to that lifeboat. Some men who knew how to sail or to row a boat. All right. My main source, I was delighted to see, was going to be, and still are, the Montana newspapers. And the Montana newspapers pretty much did the same routine that all the other newspapers in the country did. They reported on the initial disaster, and then they started reporting on the first class passengers, of course, 2/3 of which had survived. So look at the headlights. The headlines: diamonds worth $5 million, part of the cargo. Men of immense wealth aboard the wrecked Titanic. And boy, is that the truth. So we always hear about Astor, but there was a Clark on that boat as well. But I learned quickly that when it came to local news, I really had to be judicious. And for example, the Missoula boy who was bringing back his sweetheart to marry, according to her, they were just cousins, and she was in different quarters, he was in different quarters. And when Berta gets off the train, so one of the first things she does is convince people that she and Edward were not sweethearts, contrary to what the Missoulians said. So again, getting back to that propensity for the first class passengers, the two passengers that hit the front pages throughout the state were Mr. and Mrs. Walter Clark. Walter was the nephew of the Copper King, Mr. Clark, and Mr. Clark had recently, of course, been a senator for the state as well. His wife also had Montana roots. She had spent part of her years in Helena, and her dad was a U.S. Marshal working out of Helena and Butte at different times. So lots of Montana roots there. Walter Clark and his family had, although he was born in Butte, they had recently, or not so recently, they had moved to Los Angeles and started making money in Los Angeles. And Walter and his family did seem to have a knack for making money. It was amazing. So we have a testimony by this young woman that she was in bed and Walter was in the smoking lounge playing poker with some of the big shots, his friends, when she felt a bump, and she quickly got dressed and went to the smoking lounge. And at that point, Walter and a couple of other gentlemen had asked the crew what was going on, and the crew reassured them that they needed to go back to their cabins and just go back to bed. Everything was fine. But as he took Virginia back to their cabin, they were meeting people in the hallway and on the stairs that were carrying life jackets. And at one point, someone did say, "We are supposed to be meeting out on the deck." So Virginia tells a story of them going back to their stateroom. They each put several layers of clothes on. She puts her furs on, and Walter gives her money and puts it in her coat pocket with the words, "In case we get separated." When they do get to the deck, she is put on the same lifeboat as Mrs. Astor, who is the pregnant wife of the very wealthy man, Mr. Astor, who goes down with the Titanic. One of the last times Walter is seen is leaning over the rail, waving to the women next to Mr. Astor, because their wives are in the same lifeboat. So Mrs. Astor, of course, is one of those who is, Mrs. Astor. Mrs. Clark is one of those who is met personally at the docks, and she is hustled away right away and put on a train so she can get home to California. Her mom meets her there, and she spends some time trying to get over the trauma of being on the Titanic. She, that fall, takes a recuperative vacation back east, only to telegraph her parents and the Clarks that she has married a gentleman, and turn out they believe he's a ne'er-do-well. His name was Mr. Tanner. He was a divorced man, had a reputation for being good looking, and he was in New York for business, and somehow or other he and Virginia met up. At this time, the Clarks immediately take action to get custody of their grandson, because he had been with them when the Titanic went down. But Virginia was nobody's fool, and she shows up at their house with two sheriffs and picks up the 2-year-old. And so Virginia does get custody of her and Walter Clark's son. However, by the 1920 census, so 8 years later, the boy is at the Clark's home in the 1920 census. So it sounds like his mother did a lot of traveling. Again, she married Mr. Tanner. They divorced. She married a architect. They divorced, and then she remarries Mr. Tanner. And it appears she and Tanner were friends for the rest of their lives. She lives to be she dies in LA in 1958 and is buried next to Mr. Tanner. Now, the church in the lower right-hand corner there was built as the, Walter Clark Memorial Community Church. His parents gave the property and the funding to build that church in his name. Today it is in Long Beach, California, and it is known as the Lakewood Village Community Church. So sadly, Walter's memorial has been lost. And then we have the second-class passengers. And I'm always a little cautious about how I approach this group, because they were, the two women on the left were different. So let's just start with the men who did not survive the trip. There were several young men in second class. There were two boys, and I'm going to say 23 and 19, to me that's boys, from Cornwall, and they were traveling together, and they were headed to Butte, the mining town, to make their fortune. There was a blacksmith who was in that group as well, again, headed to Butte to make his fortune, and he did not make it. Now, the fuzzy picture here is Mr. Carpenter, excuse me, William Gilbert, as a matter of fact, and he had been living in Butte for 20 years. His sister ran a boarding house, his father had a business, and he had gone home earlier that spring to spend time with his mother. Sadly, just 10 days before he boards the Titanic, he sends a telegraph to family in Butte that he had missed the boat that he was supposed to get onto, and so he was reassigned to the Titanic. And there are so many sad coincidences or happy coincidences like that. So that is Mr. Gilbert, a carpenter from Butte. And you're going to notice one of the patterns here is how many people, how mobile folks are in Butte, Montana. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the women on the left, the upper picture is Ludi Parrish. She was from Kentucky, and her daughter, Mrs. Shelley, the wife of a Deer Lodge accountant, were considered social climbers. And they were in second class, which when I read the description sounds rather elegant to me, but they wind up being tossed on some levels into lifeboat 12. And Mrs. Shelley left a disposition, a narrative that she sent to the Senate and was published in the Anaconda paper. And if anybody's interested, it is in Monday morning, May 6, 1912. Page 2 it starts, and it goes on for several pages. And her testimony starts with complaints about their second class room. It's not what it was advertised to be. And it goes on to, she describes a man who is in a panic, jumps into their lifeboat as it's being lowered and lands on her mother's leg. And sadly, he does seem to injure her on some level. But they do make it back to Deer Lodge. And of course, the Deer Lodge people are thrilled to have them back. If you want something interesting to read, please read her narrative. And I've got a little bit here. This will give you an idea of Mrs. Shelley. So very few of the steerage passengers could talk English. And although some of the employees could talk a little in foreign languages, they found it almost impossible in many cases to make themselves understood. In desperation, a stewardess came to me one morning and begged me to try to speak with a Spanish girl. Well, I did not speak Spanish. However, I tried to speak to her slowly and quietly in English, and we got nowhere. Then a thought came to me to try and speak English to her, but to pitch my voice in her key and inflect an accent in the Spanish fashion. So I once more addressed myself to her using English words, but giving the Spanish inflection and turning the page. Spanish inflection and pitch. And she sensed that this young woman knew exactly what she was saying. She claims that they called a gentleman over who did speak Spanish, and sure enough, he translated, and both this young woman, Spanish woman, and Mrs. Shelley were having the same conversation. Imagine. So that is just one of the really quirky things in her testimony. Sadly, Mrs. Shelley and her accountant in Deer Lodge do separate, and she remarries, and both women wind up passing away in Hawaii after the trauma. And then the third class. And this is where it really becomes obvious that the Titanic was a boat full of immigrants. So 2 photographs here. Both of these men, one is Angelov and one is Dankov. They were boyhood friends from the same village. And they and a smaller group of Bulgarians had been in Butte the year before, made substantial money, so went home to Bulgaria for the winter and were headed back to Butte to make more of a nest egg. The man on the right was a potter and he had a child. The man on the left, excuse me, had 2 children. There is another Bulgarian, there's a Bulgarian village out of 40 Bulgarian passengers. The vast majority third-class dreams or third-class passengers. 8 of them were from one small village in Bulgaria. And I'm trying to wrap that around your head, what that had to have done to the social and economic dynamics of that little village. But their names did not come out for quite some time. But Butte, of course, was on top of it because the Serbian church in Butte was waiting for these men. The men had friends in Butte waiting for them. And so almost that first day, word is out that there are men expected from the Titanic. Sadly, they are disappointed and the men do not show up. Then we've got some people I've not been able to create stories for. There were 4 men, again, all in steerage from Croatia. 3 of them were headed to Great Falls, and they were Bertol, Ivan, and Ludovic Kor, C-O-R. They were 35, 27, and 19 years old. We do know that they were all married. I have called people with that last name in Great Falls, and no, they did not file a restraining order against me, but I'm pretty lucky that they didn't, and asked them if their families had any tales, any family tales of the Titanic, and each and every one has said no. And then we have a gentleman, a Jovan Dimic, who was traveling to Red Lodge, also Croatian. And again, those coal mines in Red Lodge were probably drawing him in. He was also married. He had a wife and 2 daughters. And I know nothing of their stories. And I certainly hope that someday someone will come along and have all sorts of tales from Bulgaria or Croatia about the men who died on the Titanic. Okay. Now we're going to get to those who survived. This is William de Messemaker. At the turn of the century, which wasn't that long ago, he and his brothers hit Valley County and they homesteaded. And they were lucky because they hit the homesteading time at the peak of the precipitation, and the conditions were just perfect for homesteading at that time. Within 6 years, there's going to be a drought and things would not look very promising. But these 3 brothers did well outside of Tampico, Montana. So William has saved his money and decides he wants a bride. So he goes home to Austria and finds Anna. And they honeymoon on the Titanic. Well, he escorts Anna to lifeboat 13, which is in this diagram in the sketch. 13 is the one in the water. and they are having trouble with their lines, but that's unknown to the boat that's coming down on top of them. So Anna is in hysterics anyway. She doesn't speak English. He assures her that things will be fine. And then he sets to work once her boat goes down over the edge, helping put people in the next one. And whether it's because he could speak English so well and could follow directions, or whether they thought he was part of the crew, he was told to get in and row. And he was nobody's fool, by golly. He got in and rowed. And it's ironic that his boat almost tipped over his wife's boat. And they would be, of course, become familiar. She would know that he survived a little bit later in the night when the boats were starting to travel together. Sadly, Anna dies of what they classify as hysteria, and I won't get into women's history and hysteria and the connotations there, but she wound up at the Mayo Clinic and died of, my guess is, cancer. So William goes back to Austria in 1920 and brings back another wife. This time, yeah, they get to Tampico, they have 4 kids, and he eventually sells the ranch and they retire, but not before he proves that he's a rather contentious old codger. He is in the court system of Valley County more than once. The worst is when the upper right-hand corner there, you see his prison picture. He steals some sheep, and it's proven that he steals the sheep, and he does a year at the state penitentiary. And there also, he goes to jail, or excuse me, goes to court because he tries to run people over in his car. And oh my gosh, I don't know if he was cranky before the Titanic, but he certainly was cranky after the Titanic. So Bill passed in 1955, and his wife Marie remarried and lived to be 1983. And this family, which has spread out all over northern Montana, did talk about the Titanic. And whenever there's an anniversary of the Titanic, they're going to show up in the Great Falls paper or the Glasgow paper, because those great-grandchildren have stories to tell that they heard from their parents. And to me, that's really a good thing. We want to know those stories, as opposed to my favorite survivor. This is Berta Nielsen. And she does live in Chicago eventually and lives to be in her 80s. There she is on the right. And there she is, probably close to 18 years old. And she is traveling with her cousin Edward from Sweden to Missoula. Now, Edward, his family, and some of Berta's family have already established themselves either on homesteads or as working in Missoula. In fact, Edward had earned the money to go home and come back by working as a dishwasher and a cook at one of the hotels in Missoula. This was the young woman who was involved in that initial story that she said is not true. She and Edward were cousins. They were not fiancés. And she has a really hard time of it. She, just a couple months after the Titanic, she is in her sister's wedding. And then she marries a gentleman, and this gets confusing because her husband's last name is Nelson. They have a little boy, but Mr. Nelson dies in the fall of 1918, perhaps by the flu. So Berta is left with a little boy, and the next census shows Berta's son living with her sister and her family in Worland, Montana. If you're not familiar with Worland, Montana, it's not there anymore because it's been covered up by Lake Koocanusa. But it was a rail stop just north of Libby, and booming lumber companies. And so lots of Swedes up there, lots of hardworking people. And in the census, Berta is working as a waitress in Butte. However, we find evidence then of Berta traveling to Warland with a gentleman named Hans Christensen, and he takes her and her son home to Chicago. They have, she doesn't pass away until 1976, well into her 80s, and they have 4 children of their own. Now, here's an interesting contrast to the Valley County folks. According to their family story, Berta was sitting with a daughter watching a movie on TV. It was a movie called A Night to Remember. I think it came out in the 50s or 60s about the sinking of the Titanic. And Berta started crying. And her daughter says, well, what's going on? And for the first time, her family hear that she was on the Titanic. She had not spoken about it, according to the family lore, until she saw that movie. So that gives us an indication of just the horror of the night and the trauma. But she did, she survived. She couldn't speak English, but she got to Missoula, Montana. She lost a husband. She saw to it that her son was taken care of, and she was obviously a hard worker. And I hope that she found happiness in Chicago with Mr. Christensen and the 4 other kids that they had. So Berta Nielsen. So there are so many other stories out there. These are just the, no pun intended, the tip of the iceberg. We've got the Core family. We have the gentleman who is headed to Red Lodge. And there are, of course, when you get into Montana newspapers, there are so many connections between relatives of relatives who are on the Titanic and whatnot, that it's fascinating. But it was, when you get down and dirty, the Titanic, contrary to what we see as with the Astors and the unsinkable Molly Brown, it was truly an immigrant ship. And it was bringing folks to the United States for a better life. And very few of them made it. William and Anna made it. Berta Nielsen made it, but they were the very, very lucky ones. So at that point, any questions? Dave, not even from you?
Dave would know this because he was in the Navy, but me being a Montana gal, those ships, you don't realize how big they are until you see like a painting or an actual picture, like that one where you had the 2 lifeboats coming down on top of each other. Mm-hmm. And you're just seeing that it's stories and stories high.
Yes.
I mean, and then you hear of people like jumping into the water as it's sinking. I don't know. It's much different than what you imagine in your head when you're just not used to seeing those every day.
It is. One of the survivors talks about the people in her boat singing so they can't hear the screams of the people who are in the water. Oh. But I'm glad to say the boat that Mrs. Clark was in, and I know Berta's boat, and I think one more, went back and did pick up some survivors. By that time, many of them had already passed away from the cold, in the cold water, but at the same time, they were willing to endanger themselves to try to get other people out of the water. And there's a story, it must be on Mrs. Astor's and Mrs. Clark's boat, about the women giving the men who have just gotten out of the water their furs and trying to get them warm. So those furs came in handy.
I think I've heard that the boats weren't all full, right?
Sadly, that is true. And as I read along, the further into this we go, the more anxious people are, because when the first couple lifeboats are filled, they're not even half capacity, because the crew firmly believes that they're going to have to pull them up out of the drink later on that night. and bring them back on board. The crew does not believe they're sinking. And then, of course, well, Edward, when he finds Berta, reports that there's water on the floor of his room. And so, of course, third class passengers were in the bottom. And so, if anything, boy, the third class passengers knew what was going on. Sadly, they did. But it's so, I wish I had a word for it. It's not ethnocentrism, it's not cockiness, but that lack of forethought with how few lifeboats there were. There had been no emergency drills. The crew did not know how to lower the lifeboats to the water. And it was just one debacle like that after another. And then, of course, the first debacle is, heaven forbid, we don't want the decks overcrowded. So we're not going to put 32 boats, we're going to put 20.
And even if they had put 32, that's not even enough for the passengers. You said it was only enough for 1,060 passengers.
Those were the rules.
Why would the rules say that you put fewer boats on than there are passengers? That doesn't even make sense.
Well, that gives you an idea of what it was like in 1912.
You know, there's that other boat that sank shortly after that had some issues with having too many lifeboats because the rules changed. And so they put too many lifeboats on it. And I think the lifeboats are what made it capsize.
Oh my gosh.
I'm kind of curious what the number of lifeboats was to passengers on that one.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'd have to find that boat back, figure out which one it was.
But no, they weren't worried about saving everybody. And again, with the Titanic, its builders, her owners, her captain, her crew did not believe she was sinkable. And what hubris that was. Ouch. Very sad.
So when I know it wasn't this time, but you mentioned there was a fellow that jumped into one of the boats. Maybe you did mention it this time.
I'm going to ask you to say that again, Maria.
There was a fellow you mentioned that jumped into one of the boats. Landed on the mom's leg.
Yes.
Her name was. You got to wonder if he ever dared admit to anyone that he was on the Titanic after that. Or
you know what?
That story.
I think towards the last, it didn't matter. When they finally realized that the boat was going down, for lack of a different term, it was every man for himself. When Mrs. Shelley talks about that incident, she says, an Italian jumped on my mother and bruised her leg. But of course, you can, if you get into the records, he was a Frenchman and he jumped in out of panic. And there are stories of some of the crew having guns to keep people back as they loaded up the women and children. But as far as I know, no one was actually shot. And that poor gentleman, he made it to New York, but he will always go down in history as that Italian who jumped on Mrs. Shelley's mother.
I didn't get a chance to look at that newspaper, but I plan to. It sounds like a really good one to read.
All right. I can't believe Dave doesn't have any questions.
Me neither.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yeah,
Maria, thank you. Oh.
Well, there's a lot of rumors and stuff that part of the reason why they didn't put on some of the stuff I think I remember is they didn't put on any more life boats so that the first class passengers would have more of a run of the deck up above, and then also that part of the lifeboats that they did have, the way that the ship sank was that you couldn't get all of the lifeboats launched because of the angle of the ship and stuff on there. So that even though they had the 20, there wasn't as many of them that really got. I came up. I drove boats and lifeboats on the cargo ship that I was on, and I got dumped in out halfway between the States and Hawaii, and it looked quite calm, but it wasn't. We got to rocking back and forth, and we split it was a wooden boat that I was on in also on it that would hit the side, and it broke quite a few of the ribs when we were coming back aboard. There was only 3 of us in there on it, but it's not much fun even in the broad daylight, let alone at night.
Thank you. One of the things I did not introduce, when we see this row of boats, the Carpathia put as many of the lifeboats as they could on their deck, and they weren't able to take them all back to New York. But as far as we know, not a single one survived, because the Titanic had sister ships, and they were dispersed to her sister ships. So that is the string of Titanic lifeboats after they get to New York. All right. What do you think, Maria?
Very, very much so, Anne. And I know that I forgot to introduce you at the beginning.
Oh,
Dave knows who you are.
Everybody knows me.
Lori knows you.
And I hope this is viewed a lot, because I just really, these are important stories.
I can't get over that cartoon picture right there that you have on screen. Like, I can't get over, like, that is so insensitive. I mean, right after a boat capsizes and you put that picture, I don't know.
But 1912 was a different world.
I guess.
Yeah, no, it was. We wouldn't recognize the world until sometime after World War I. So yeah. When you're time traveling, don't go further back than World War I.
I'll remember that next time I hop in the time travel machine. Thank you so much, Zoanne.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Take care.
See ya.